Hello students, I am Raghavan Kumar Singh, faculty of US Academy and Institute. Today we will discuss class 9th history first chapter, the French Revolution. In this chapter we will discuss the Declaration of Right of Man, notion of equality and freedom, anti-colonial movement in India, China, Africa and South America. The French Revolution leads to the end of monarchy in France. In 1789, in the wake of early mourning, the city of Paris was in a state of alarm. Rumors spread that the king would open fire upon the citizens. People started gathering and they started breaking a number of government buildings in search of arms. The commander of the Bastille was killed in the armed fight and the prisoners were released. People hated the Bastille as it stood for the despotic power of the king. People protested against the high price of bread. A new chain of events began, which led to the execution of the king. The French society during the late 18th century. Louis XVI in 1774 ascended the throne of France. Financial France was drained because of the war. France under Louis XVI helped the 13 American colonies to gain their independence from Britain. Taxes were increased to meet regular expenses, such as the cost of maintaining an army, the court, running government offices or universities. The country of France was divided into 3 states. In the 18th century, the feudal system was part of the society state dated back to the Middle Ages. 90% of the population was dominated by peasants, but only a small number of them owned the land they cultivated. 60% was owned by nobles, the church, and other richer members of the third state. The clergy and the nobility members of the first 2 states enjoyed certain privilege by birth. These group of members were exempted from paying tax and enjoying feudal privilege. All members of the third state had to pay taxes to the state, which included a direct tax called tille and a number of indirect tax which were levied an article of everyday consumption like salt or tobacco. The struggle for survival. Increase in population led to a rapid increase for food grains. Production of grains could not keep pace with the demand, due to which the price of bread rose rapidly. Due to low wages paid to the laborers, the gap between the poor and the rich widened. Things became worse whenever drought or hail reduced the harvest. Now, a growing middle class emphasis on end of privilege. Peasants used to participate in revolt against taxes and food scarcity. Groups of the third estate had become prosperous and had access to education and new ideas. In the 18th century, new social group emerged, termed the middle class, who earned their wealth through expanding overseas trade by manufacturing woolen and silk textiles that were either exported or bought by the richer members of society. The third estate included professions such as lawyer or administrative officials. A person's social position was dependent on their merit. All of these were educated and believed that no group in society should be privileged by birth. Rather, a person's social position must depend on his merit. A new form of government was proposed by Rousseau based on a social contract between peoples and their representative. Similarly, Montesquieu proposed a division of power within the government between the legislative, the executive, and the judiciary. In the USA, this model of government was put into force. Louis XVI planned to impose further taxes to meet the expenses. Now, the outbreak of the revolution. In France, the monarch didn't have the power to expose taxes. They had to call a meeting of the States General, a political body to which the three states sent their representatives to pass proposals for new taxes. Louis XVI, on 5th May 1789, called an assembly to pass proposals for new taxes. Representatives from the first and the second states were present, and the third state was represented by its prosperous and educated members. According to the principle, each state had one vote, but representatives from the third state demanded each member would have one vote. The demand was rejected. So, members of the third state walked out to protest. They swore not to disperse till a constitution drafted for France that would limit the power of the monarchy. Due to the severe winter, bread price rose and people had to spend hours in long queues. Rumors spread that the lord of the manor hired a band of brigands to destroy the ripe crops. In fear, peasants started looting, hoarding grains, and burned down documents containing records of monarchical dues. Nobles fled from their home. Louis XVI accorded recognition to the National Assembly and accepted the principle that his power would from now on be checked by a constitution. The Assembly passed a decree abolishing the feudal system of obligation and taxes on 4th August 1789. Tithes were abolished and lands owned by the church were confiscated. France became a constitutional monarchy. In 1791, the National Assembly completed the draft of the Constitution, and its main object was to limit the power of the monarchy. These powers were now separated and assigned to different institutions like the legislature, the executives, and the judiciary. France became a constitutional monarchy. Citizens voted for a group of electors who in turn chose the assembly. But unfortunately, not every citizen had the right to vote. Men above 25 years of age who paid taxes equal to at least 3 days of a laborer wages were entitled to vote. The Constitution began with a declaration of the right of man and citizen right, such as the right to life, freedom of speech, freedom of opinion, equality before law, were established as natural and inalienable rights. That is, they belong to each human being by birth and could not be taken away. France abolished monarchy and became a republic. In April 1792, the National Assembly voted for a war against Prussia and Austria. Marseillaise became the national anthem of France. While men were away fighting at the war, women took care of the families. Large section of the population demanded that the revolution had to be carried further, as the Constitution of 1791 gave political right only to the richer section of society. Political clubs were formed, and among them Jacobin became the most successful club. Members of the Jacobin club included small shopkeeper, artisan, printer, shoemaker, pastry cooks, watchmaker, as well as servant and daily wages workers. Jacobin members started wearing long striped trousers, similar to those worn by dock workers. These Jacobins were called the sans culottes, literally meaning those without knee breeches. On August 10, 1792, Jacobin stormed the place of the Tuileries and held the king hostage for several hours. Elections were held, and all men of 21 years and above got the right to vote. Monarchy was abolished in 21st September 1792, and France was declared a republic. Louis XVI was sentenced to death by a court on the charge of treason. Now, the Reign of Terror. The period from 1793 to 1794 is referred to as the Reign of Terror. People who Robespierre saw enemies of the Republic were arrested, imprisoned, and then tried by a revolutionary tribunal if they were declared guilty by the court. Then they were guillotined. The guillotine is a device consisting of two poles and a blade with which a person is beheaded. named after Dr. Guillotine laws, were issued to place a maximum ceiling on wages and prices. Meat and bread were rationed expensive while flour were forbidden. Equality was practiced through forms of speech and address. All Frenchmen and women were addressed as a citoyen and citoyenne as a citizen. In July 1794, he was convicted by a court, arrested, and the next day sent to the guillotine. Now, the director rule France. Fall for the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle class to seize power. According to the new constitution, non-propertied sections of society denied voting if provided for a true elected legislative council. The government appointed a directory consisting of executives made up of 5 members. Political instability paved the way for a military dictator named Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, did women have a revolution? Women were active participants from the beginning, which brought important changes in the country of France. Women from the third state had to work for a living and they didn't have access to educate or job training. Women started with their daughters of nobles of the third states were allowed to study at a convent. Working women also had to care of their families. Compared to men, their wages were lower. Women also started their political clubs and newspapers. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was one of the most famous women's clubs. They demanded equal political right as men, the right to vote and to hold political offices. The revolutionary government introduced laws to improve the lives of women. Schooling becomes compulsory, divorce made legal, and they could run a small business. During the Reign of Terror, the government closed women's clubs, banned their political activities. After much struggle, women in France in 1946 won the right to vote. Now, the abolition of slavery. Jacobin regime most revolutionary social reforms was the abolition of slavery in the French colonies. In the 17th century, slavery trade began. Slaves were brought from local chieftains, branded and shackled, and were packed tightly into ships for the 3-month long voyage across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Slave labor met the growing demand in European markets for sugar, coffee, and indigo. Throughout the 18th century, there were little criticism of slavery in France. In 1794, the convention legislated to free all slaves in the French overseas possession. Napoleon introduced slavery after 10 years. In 1848, slavery was abolished in French colonies. Now, the revolution and everyday life. The revolution and everyday life. France during 1789 saw changes in the lives of men, women, and children. Abolition of censorship happened in the summer of 1789. Declaration of the right of man and citizen proclaimed freedom of speech and expression to be a natural right. Freedom of press meant opposing views of event could be expressed. Plays, songs, and festive procession attracted large number of peoples. Now, the conclusion of this chapter. Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself as an emperor of France in 1804 and introduced many laws such as the protection of private property and a uniform system of weight and measures provided by the decimal system. Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo in 1815. The ideas of liberty and democratic rights were the most important legacy of the French Revolution. Colonized peoples reworked on the idea of freedom to create a sovereign nation state.